When the RMS Titanic sank on a cold night in 1912, barely 700 people escaped with their lives. Among them were 6 Chinese men. Arriving in New York, these 6 were met with suspicion and slander. Fewer than 24 hours later, they were expelled from the country and vanished. Now, at last, their story is being told through a documentary film and now a book that's dropping April 8th. Ladies and gentlemen, hello and welcome to Titanic Legacy, the podcast. A podcast that explores Titanic's lasting impact through conversations with creators, authors, artists, historians, filmmakers, musicians, game developers, and more who continue to keep the Ship of Dreams legacy not only alive, but thriving through their creative work. I'm your host, Paul Carganilla, and today I'm excited to bring you a conversation with Stephen Schwankert, an award-winning writer and editor with 25 years of experience in Greater China, focusing on exploration, technology, and culture. He is the co-creator of The Six, a book and documentary project about the Chinese passengers aboard RMS Titanic. Stephen's work has been published in world-renowned and regionally recognized publications. If you are a Titanic enthusiast, which, of course, if you're listening to this, you probably are, this introduction is no new news to you. I first met, in air quotes, Stephen through interviews on LA Beatles' Unsinkable podcast, and subsequently heard from him on Titanic Talk and Titanic Talk Line. Somewhere in there, I subscribed to his original podcast, Titanic New Jersey. He's bouncing all over the world, researching and promoting. I'm so glad to have the opportunity to really meet and get to know him personally for the first time today here over the magic of the internet and Zoom. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming to Titanic Legacy author Stephen Schwankert. Hello, sir. So great to finally meet you.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks for having me.
I always tell people, through the magic of the internet and the magic of this podcast, I get to have conversations with people all over the world. Where in the world are you today? I know you bounce around.
So I usually like to say I'm in sunny New Jersey. It's not very sunny today. It's a little bit of a gray day, a little bit of mist. First, wants to be spring, but it's not spring just yet. So I'm in New Jersey. I'm about 3 miles from the ocean, where we've been for the last 30-ish years, or at least my mother's been here for the last 30-ish years. So here we are.
I had the pleasure of spending the best weeks of autumn in New Jersey. And I got to tell you, it was the first time I got to really experience an autumn, having grown up here in Southern California. But gosh, it's beautiful out there. I was out there at the end of October, early November, and I got to track down and find Charles Joffin's marker.
Were you the person who left the brandy bottle?
No, I didn't leave it there, but I definitely poured some out for him while we were there. And I loved your commentary on, I've got to question his story a little bit, if we're being real here. But I digress. Let's jump back into your creative work. And before we talk about the book that's dropping the same day this audio podcast is dropping, April 8th, on Amazon or wherever I'm sure you find your books, you can ask for it. Every great story has an origin story. And when you reflect on all of the work, the years of work you did on the Six, what would you say was the first thing that got the ball rolling?
So the Six came about, it was really calved off of another project. My creative partner, Arthur Jones, and I, Arthur is the director of the documentary, and he and I had done a previous project together called Poseidon, and it was the same sort of format. I wanted to write a book. He wanted to make a documentary. They are somewhat different. The stories that they tell are somewhat different. We had a lot of fun doing it, and then at the end of it, we thought, okay, that was great. Didn't cost us a lot of money. Let's do another one. And so I thought, okay, that's pretty straightforward. There's this Shanghai shipwreck I would love to do something on. It's, untold story, mystery that we can solve, and so forth. So as we got into the story, we started to think, well, how are we going to tell this story without going into a lot of background about the Chinese Civil War and, the ship and so forth and so on. And we thought, well, the easiest way to do that is just to compare it to Titanic. Titanic is the alpha and the omega of shipwrecks. It's the shipwreck that everybody thinks of when they think of a shipwreck, in terms of loss of life, in terms of loss of property. And so we thought, okay, that's the gold standard. And that's true in China as much as it is in the US and elsewhere. So I went back to my Titanic bookshelf, which of course I had, and I started to reread some of the classics and Night to Remember and so forth. And I also started to look online, and it sort of before the last time I had paid any attention to Titanic material, the whole Encyclopedia Titanica site had risen up and filled out and so forth. And it was when I was poking around on that I saw this reference to Chinese sailors on Titanic. Now, I know that I had probably seen either that page or something similar before. I knew that there were Chinese passengers on Titanic, but like just about everybody else who viewed the page, I read it and said, wow, that's really interesting. Click on to the next page because there just really wasn't that much there. So instead of staring at the ceiling at night, wondering about my Shanghai shipwreck, I started to think about these Chinese passengers. Why don't we know anything more about them? Why hasn't their story been told? That's just very strange. I mean, when you compare it to, and I always, people always kind of point the finger at me and say that I'm picking on the Irish. I'm not. I'm more Irish than I am anything else. So, I'm just using it as a convenient example. But we know so much about the story seemingly of every Irish villager that was on board Titanic, where they came from and what boat they were in and where they ended up and who they married, where they're buried. But we knew almost nothing about these Chinese passengers. And I thought, well, that's just not possible, really, that they didn't go on. And you're telling me that I realize it's a small sample size. You only have these six survivors, but you're telling me that they never told anybody about their experience, didn't have families, that story isn't out there somewhere. And I thought, I think we should start paying attention to this and try to go get it. And so that's really where it started. It was just nagging curiosity. It was a question I couldn't answer readily, and it was a question that I wanted to answer.
I think one of the greatest tragedies, of course, hindsight is being what it is, the fact that we had the inquiries, sure, but they only spoke to a very small sample size of survivors. And if we had just sat all the survivors down, third class, second class, and gotten their stories or what they remember from that night, a lot of the mystery around Titanic would, be cleared up, but also so many stories could be told, and we could examine what went on in the years past, and what the survivors ended up, how it affected their lives and their families. I talk about it often with survivors, family members on this show, but there was either, the survivor that talked about it readily immediately after, and there were the survivors that you do not talk about that in this household, and how sad that is, that so much has already been lost of Titanic's history because of the survivors' stories that have faded away. I think I've ordered your book. It's going to hit my doorstep April 8th, but I've seen the movie, and what really fascinated me was your ability to dig into these stories where there are just breadcrumbs, but then they lead somewhere and you find them. How exciting is that?
I mean, it's funny because one of the things we had to do in the documentary was to make archival work look exciting. And it seems that we succeeded at least partially, because people have said that to us, with that, oh, that eureka moment when you find something, and we've somehow made going to the library to be kind of cooler than maybe it actually is. But it's I'm interested in both with the six and with Poseidon, and with anything I do in the future. I'm not interested in just retreading the story that exists. That's just not interesting. It might be more lucrative potentially, but it's just not something I'm going to spend 3 to 6 years on, which is about what it takes to do a project like this. And to me, one thing that has been missing from Titanic and the Titanic story, especially now as we move away from the era of having survivors to talk to, and in many cases, even their children aren't with us any longer. We really need to let the facts speak for themselves. I think for example, I'm sorry, Eugene Nesmanyov's book, Breaking Titanic, which is about to come out. I think something like that, where you're talking about an actual forensic analysis, a physical analysis of a part of the story, that's really where we need to go forward. That was something we tried to do with the six, in terms of constructing a lifeboat and putting real people in it, to see how many would fit. Could you fit under the slats? Could you hide on board? Testing myself in cold water for dexterity and so forth. Those are parts of the Titanic story that we really have not put to the test. And it would tell us a ton, without giving away bits of the documentary and bits of the book. There were things that happened in the process of that research that we just never expected. And therein, lay the answer. And that was the whole point, because you just can't, one of my Arthur hates it when I say this, but one of my favorite lines comes from the movie Ronin, the John Frankenheimer, Robert De Niro, and De Niro's looking at a map, and he says, the map is not the territory." And that's so true, and it's so true. With Titanic, we always look at the map, but we never look at the territory. We don't go to the territory, and I'm not talking about going to the wreck necessarily. I'm talking about, how big is a lifeboat? How big is a person in relation to it? And what does it tell us? Sit where Ismay sat in the boat, and what can he see on a dark night with no moon? Those are easy things to test, and yet that part of Titanic research has been explored so little. And I think there's so much more that we could learn from it if we did that. We tried to do it in the six. I hope we were successful.
It is super entertaining and interesting to see those segments that you just mentioned, recreating the lifeboat, you getting in the water. One of the things that I really loved was watching you get together with the Titanic Honor and Glory team and making active discoveries while they're showing you what all the stuff that they've been working on, and getting into the minds of these Chinese passengers, and just that is, I encourage anybody who hasn't seen it yet, but if you find the documentary film on Magellan TV on Roku, you can watch these discoveries happen in real time. And that is so much fun. How thrilling is it for you when the camera's rolling?
I mean, I've learned to ignore the camera, which is great, because otherwise it can be a little bit of an impediment. It's somebody sitting in a meeting that shouldn't be there, in some ways. But the great thing about that virtual reality walkthrough, and I think we'll see a lot more of that going forward. That's the kind of technological development that we're going to be able to use in the future as a tool. But when you look at, again, the map is not the territory. If you look at Titanic deck plans and you say, okay, these guys were on G or F deck and they've got to get to the boat deck, where are they going to go? It seems like they just have too many choices. They could walk all the way to the stern, and there's always, but the reality is they come out of their cabin, the watertight doors have already dropped, and they really have no choice but to go up the stairway. And you wouldn't know that looking at the deck plans, and you wouldn't know that because they left behind no firsthand accounts. So, again, unless you can put yourself there and walk around yourself, whether it's virtually or in some sort of realistic manner, you're just not going to see what they saw. And that's the difference. That's the perspective. So much of historical perspective until right about now has been impossible to recreate. We can only imagine it, or maybe we can draw it, or we can, get some set builders to put something up and walk through it. But, the reality is that now we really can recreate these things as they were. The correct shade of wood, the signage above exit doors and stairwells and so forth. And that's what's going to lead to further understanding, if not discovery. So, being able to use those tools is pretty cool. I'm probably in an age where I'm not going to be the first to use them. Somebody's going to have to show me how to use them, but I hope it leads us to a greater understanding of both the disaster and the experience as we go forward.
So many great tools coming with the new technology that's being developed. I had on the show a couple of months ago the team from Magellan that did the underwater scans and created the video game type platform where you can go down. You don't have to put yourself 2.5 miles underwater. You can actually just pull it up on your video screen and explore in great detail the wreck site, which is fascinating. And I have to shamelessly plug Titanic weekend on the Queen Mary on April 12th through 14th. On the 14th, we're going to have the Titanic Honor and Glory team there doing their live stream. And then on that Sunday, the 13th, James Panko will be there with the virtual walkthrough that we're talking about. And he can take you through that. So I hope you join us. Check that out at titanicweekend.com. But one reason when I started thinking about starting this podcast, I was like, there's already so many podcasts out there. Why does there need to be more? But me being a creative, I'm just always so fascinated by how Titanic continues to inspire people to create new work. And that is evident in the work that you're doing, Honor and Glory is doing, Magellan's doing, and some of the authors we've had on, Brad Payne, who's, I don't know if you're familiar with his book,
Sure.
1140, just what is it that fascinates us to keep exploring, keep digging, keep creating? The Titanic story is just so rich, and it leads people down roads they probably never saw themselves going. Did you ever see yourself sitting in a room with James Cameron pitching your project?
No, no, I did not. Um, I mean, I grew up, where I live now in New Jersey is not so far from where I grew up. I grew up in a bit more inland, but I'm really a product of the Jersey Shore, in the sand and the surf kind of way, not the horrendous MTV TV show way. But I always love the water and I love the ocean and the things in it and underneath it. And shipwrecks were just something I was always aware of. It was always interesting. It was always, obviously it's tragic. I don't want to diminish the tragic elements of shipwrecks, but as a part of history, as a part of maritime history, shipwrecks are a big part of that. So there was just always an awareness that there were big wrecks out there. The Andrea Doria, excuse me, the Titanic, obviously not right off the Jersey coast, but kind of out that way beyond the horizon. And so it was never something that was particularly foreign. I remember when Ballard found it. I remember reading National Geographic when it finally came out. I remember seeing the specials when they came on, and it was just you couldn't imagine it. Like, what do you mean they found it? How could you find it? It's the ocean is so vast, and even a big ship like that, is so small relatively, and it's so deep, and there were just so many um, elements to it that suddenly, we had crossed, we had passed through a membrane into a new era of underwater exploration. And this really highlighted that. And then when we started to get the pictures back and so forth. But I thought, I wasn't interested in it to the point where I thought that there was a contribution that I could make. And so I didn't actively ponder it. It's funny because the first time I read A Night to Remember was when I was teaching English in China. That was the first time that I had ever lived there in 1991. And it was just a book that they had in the library, and I read it. And I thought, oh yeah, I've never read that. I should read that. And so I read it. And in terms of James Cameron, I saw the film. I saw the film in China. I saw it in a cinema where the film was shown slightly out of focus. And excuse me, imagine sitting through that for 2 hours and 40 minutes. And I guess the projectionist had either gone home but there was no way to fix the focus. So the first time I saw it, it was slightly out of focus, which made me want to see it again because I thought, I bet this looks pretty cool when it's actually a sharp picture. But I mean, it was crazy because at the time, people in China didn't really go to cinemas. They loved movies, but the cinema experience wasn't great. It was like sitting in a high school auditorium and people are smoking, and it was expensive, relatively. It was quite expensive to see a film then. But not only did people go to see it, they went to see it again. And so, I remembered that very clearly. So, when Arthur and I got to this point with the other story, and we started to talk about Titanic and China, we had both been here and both experienced that. Not to mention that the Celine Dion song was played everywhere constantly for 10 years after it came out. Well, I mean, the only thing that put a stop to that was the Olympics. It was only the rise of Olympic songs that really kind of pushed Celine Dion, to a different plane. And so, but when I started to think about, here's an opportunity to put my adopted country, I was in China for 25 years, to put that together with Titanic, this massive story that was that was so beloved there, and to let people know that they're part of it, that was just something I didn't really want to pass up. It was just something we need to look into. And very early on, we became aware that James Cameron clearly knew about the Chinese passengers. Um, if I had watched all of the material on the double box set DVD that I know we all have, and I had watched all the deleted scenes much earlier in life, I would have known that there was a deleted scene of the rescue of a Chinese passenger who actually worked on the film. He was actually a tech on the film. And, once we saw that, we thought, okay, he knew about this. That means that somewhere there's a file, in James Cameron's file cabinet that says, Chinese passengers. And so we really wanted to know what he wanted to know, and how much did he know? And gee, that rescue of the Chinese passenger kind of looks like that Jack and Rose ending. I wonder if they're connected somehow. So we wanted to know what James Cameron knew, and when he knew it. And so I had met him in Beijing in 2011 at a press conference. But more importantly, I'd met all the people around him. I met his business partner, Maria Wilhelm. I met some of his, media and production people. And I filed all those email addresses away for a rainy day. And that rainy day came in sometime in 2018. And it took a little while. I mean, he's a busy man. He's got stuff that he wants to do. And rightly so. He was, chest deep in Avatar, I think the second Way of Water at that point. Um, but we made him an offer that we hoped he wouldn't refuse, which was, we'll take any 15 minutes you have anywhere in the world. And so originally that was supposed to be July 4th weekend, 2019 in LA. And then there was an earthquake there. And he said, okay, we're not going to LA. He said, if you want to do this, you got to come down to New Zealand. So we said, okay. And as soon as he became aware of it, he was interested. He said, let's make this happen. When he came for the interview, he was prepped, he was ready. He didn't need water, he didn't need, a little bit of rouge. He was ready to go. And he was very helpful afterwards. He didn't have a ton of time to spend with us while we were there, but he was really helpful afterward. His executive producing the documentary really came from us meeting him, and his interest in the project. He wanted to see us succeed with this, and we're super grateful. He wrote the foreword for the both editions of the English version and for the Chinese edition. And of course, as I said, he's executive producer on the documentary, so he was a huge help. And I mean, let's face it, he's one of our top Titanic experts. He doesn't do that much on it anymore, not publicly, but if you want to know something about Titanic, James Cameron knows a lot and can tell you a lot about it.
I laughed when I visited Washington, D.C., I think maybe last year, and I visited the memorial there, and I thought, this looks a lot like maybe it inspired the flying scenes from Titanic. So I made a short like TikTok. Did James Cameron get his inspiration from this? And somebody commented, he's still alive, why don't you ask him? And I thought, yeah, why don't I just call James Cameron and ask him? But you are someone who is able to do that through keeping your contacts. That's incredible. And it goes to show, networking is so important in any sort of creative aspect. So keep those phone numbers, keep those contacts. And I always say on all of my shows, whether it's this show or my podcast specifically for creatives, ask. The
Yeah.
worst that can happen is someone will say no. Oh, well.
Yeah.
All right. I got a few minutes left with you here. I want to know about the book. For anyone who has seen the documentary, how is the book any different, or how does it complement the film?
So it's not written as a companion book to the film, meaning the story is my take on it. It's from the same body of research, but it is handled in a different way. Obviously, in a visual medium like film, you have to show the story. You can't just, people will only put up with so many seconds of me explaining something to the camera. They want to see it. The book gave me the opportunity to go into a lot more depth with things like how did they get off? How did they survive? I think it talks a lot more about Ismay, the testimony that Ismay gives, especially at the American Inquiry, mentions the Chinese passengers. That's one of the ways we know about them, what we know from that. But it tells us, is Ismay telling the truth? Is he, you know, is he fudging his story because they're trying to paint him with a brush? They're trying to paint him as a coward. So, I like to think of them. This is a strange Hamlet reference, but I like to think of the Chinese passengers as Rosencrantz and Guildenstern on the Titanic. So, for those of you who weren't paying attention in high school, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are these two minor characters, which our men are. It doesn't diminish them as people, but in the Titanic story, they're more minor characters, but they illuminate big parts of the story. They really tell us a lot more about what's going on in the larger Titanic, who got to escape, why. They tell us a lot about third class passengers. And then, what happened to them? One thing we liked about the peg of Titanic is, okay, not everybody knows what was going on in 1912, but they say, okay, Titanic 1912, okay, I get it. You can start a story from there. And then to kind of float out from there and they're to be able to tell their immigration story from there, how they got pushed back and forth across the Atlantic, how, one ends up in the United States, one in the UK, one in Canada. And you get to see the various forces and obstacles that they were up against, trying to achieve their own dreams along that way. It was just, it was the perfect peg. It was a great way to go mess around in a dusty corner of Titanic history that nobody had really, looked at, and it really gave us a way of giving a fresh angle on the Chinese diaspora and Chinese immigration around the world.
What's next for Stephen Schwankert? This has been a 6-year journey for you. When you turn the page, what's on it?
So I'm going back to finish the Shanghai shipwreck story. I don't know if Arthur will be joining me this time, but I have to finish it. And then there's an Asian American story that I'm looking at, a little bit earlier time period, but something that I think it's not a maritime history story, which gives me a little bit of trepidation, to have to, become an amphibious creature and come live on the land for a little while. But it's, should be equally illuminating and, should take me to some very interesting places. So stay tuned.
I'm excited to dig into that once you start releasing everything, as I want to tell everybody where to get your stuff. There are links in the details of this video to the 6 documentary film on Magellan TV through Roku channel, the 6 on Amazon.com. The book, it's coming April 8th, and That's how it looks as represented by the creator himself. Thank you so much, Steven Schwankert, for joining us. If you want to follow him on Instagram, he's at @schwankert. The link is below as well. And if you enjoyed this episode, please be sure to subscribe, rate, leave a positive review on your favorite platform. And let's say thank you one more time to our guest today, Steven Schwankert.
Thanks for having me, Paul.
Oh, you're the best. And this has been a lot of fun. Thanks to everybody for tuning in, making us part of your day. Until the next episode, seize the day, follow your heart's fire, and make each day count. Thanks, everybody.